Hello, I'm Marion Fulker and I'm the CEO of Perth's leading think tank, the Committee for Perth. Welcome to FACTBase Talks, an online series where you get to hear the latest research from our organisation. FACTBase is a long-standing joint venture research program between the Committee for Perth and the University of Western Australia. We are the leaders in delivering tangible research that drives structural, cultural and behaviour change on issues that matter to the people of Greater Perth. To date, the partnership has produced more than 80 pieces of research, creating a knowledge base on issues that affect our region and its future. These include the economy, global competitiveness, transport and mobility, gender equality, and the region's demography and geography, to name but a few. Each of these is available on our website for download free of charge. This current series of FACTBase Talks is the opportunity to share incremental research on our Future of Work project, which aims to equip WA and its people for the changing world of work. I trust you find the information and analysis contained in this presentation stimulating and that it adds to your understanding of a complex issue that affects us all.
Many thanks, Marion, and thanks for this opportunity from the Committee for Perth to collate our research in this area and present it to you. Just the sort of audience that we want to get our work in front of. So many thanks for this opportunity. Thanks also to my co-authors, who you'll see named on the fact-based report itself. Certainly couldn't have done this work without them, and it is the culmination of quite a considerable body of research done over the last 18 months or so. Okay, and so the next slide, please. This talk's going to be on about leadership. Now, leadership was one of the key themes that came out of a number of research projects we did in real time during the COVID pandemic restrictions here in WA and also across in other parts of Australia. And so it's what's feeding into it is the real experiences of people who are managing flexible workers or people who are working remotely as a consequence of the COVID pandemic. So the talk also overviews some of the published international research on the experience of organisations working under the pandemic restrictions here and overseas. Next slide, please. So it's important to consider how work has changed in relation to where we were pre-pandemic and now. And these are just some of the areas that are relevant to this issue of working remotely or working from home. So pre-pandemic, we may have thought of the office more of as a place of confinement, although of course we all know that over a period of years this has begun to change and new flexible forms of working have become more common. But the pandemic has obviously greatly accelerated that move. So the office is now much more seen as a place of where we meet and collaborate in a new normal. We were used to a more fixed work location. Now we have greater autonomy of where we work, and that can include working at home, working in hubs of different sorts, and working in the office. And many people are beginning to combine those options in a more active working model that gives more autonomy over the where and when we work. We were used to fit for purpose offices, whereas at least under the COVID pandemic restrictions and also into the new normal, we might be working in more suboptimal environments. And we've all heard the stories of people, you know, including perhaps ourselves, working at the kitchen bench, working on the sofa, maybe even in bed, and not necessarily in the beautifully designed ergonomic environment that was intended for the activity of work. We were used to in-person supervision, whereas now we're in a more virtual supervision situation when we are working remotely a lot of the time. And that has implications obviously for both manager and worker. Same with the teamwork. And then also the line manager leadership has begun to be replaced with greater emphasis on self-leadership. And I think that's something that's important, that we instill some more of those sorts of skills into people who are working flexibly. And then I guess most importantly, moving from a mindset of an inputs-based culture to one of an outcomes-based. And so rather than perhaps managers thinking about performance management and productivity in terms of the inputs, the hours spent working, where someone was and so on, and more focusing on what was actually produced, the outcomes based. So that is a shift in thinking that is based on trust, and of course when it doesn't happen, flexible working does not work well. So they're just some of the changes, and they remind us that it's more than simply shifting the place in which we work. Next slide, please. Additional changes faced by people working from home, and this is from the literature published as a result of studies internationally about the pandemic, and we sort of distilled them down into these 6 areas, which together add up to create well-being or mental health outcomes for workers and indeed managers. So this starts from the literature, and if I just give you some examples, task related challenges or additional risk can include longer work hours, more work intensification, additional tasks due to working flexibly. They could be around taking on new tasks due to other groups not being able to do them, or additional tasks just simply created by the different technologies used and so on. The loss of track of time. I'll flip to family-related issues we're more familiar with, and these are the ones that sort of get more coverage in the press, and we're all, I guess, more aware of about that work-home interface challenge, those conflicts, the ability to manage boundaries, caring responsibilities, and so on, distractions. The physical work environment, well, the literature tells us that many people work under poor physical work conditions, and that, of course, we are aware of. A breakdown in normal interactions with colleagues, that's really important. Much of what we do in an office or a central environment is made efficient by ability to touch base with colleagues physically around us in quick time, as opposed to having to contact them digitally. And that this can make a real difference to the experience of work, to efficiencies and so on, and also, of course, to the social aspect. In terms of social and organisational factors, one of the things that comes up quite a lot in the literature is this autonomy paradox, where people have more autonomy, but on one hand, as an advantage, but as a disadvantage, there seems to be a pressure or perhaps an expectation that they're constantly connected or needing to be responsive. And that, of course, is a real well-being concern, and something that certainly needs to be addressed by good bosses. Technology-related factors. We all have had a bit of techno stress during this period. We all know, and we're doing it right now, although in a very positive way, an organised way, but the use of constant Zoom meetings and other technical aspects such as technology failing, lack of technical support and so on, all add to our stress. And then the 6th factor, psychosocial factors, and there, as you'd imagine, quite a lot in the literature about issues that relate directly to some of these things we've been talking about. Negative emotional responses to threats to income and job losses, so some job insecurity, burnout and fatigue, mental stress from isolation, and psychological distress from many of those other factors that I've mentioned. So the literature talks to a considerable extent about the demands on workers and managers. We also found, if we could go to the next slide, some specific things in our research. So the additional demands on line managers include, I'm not going to go through all of these, but just mention some. Obviously, that added relational responsibility of the line manager. The relational aspect of managing distributed work teams is considerable. We all know there needs to be a balance between task and people management as leaders. But the shift during the pandemic very much was towards needing more relational management. This took additional skills and also additional time from managers. So we don't always think about the extra load on managers. It's not just workers that had extra demands on them. The emotional thing, this came up quite a lot in our research, and we feel it's really important. Dealing with team, personal and emotional issues that managers became aware of due to the window they had into people's lives during the pandemic that they may not have been aware of before. And of course, Some of these things were quite extreme, dealing with domestic violence issues, dealing with people with extreme distress about relatives who are sick overseas and the like, people dealing with just those general emotional issues that come from being under great pressure. And this certainly requires a new skill set that many line managers are not equipped to deal with. If we go to the next slide, please. The additional demands on flexible workers, isolation is the big one, so much in the literature, so much in our research as well. That loss of personal contact seems to create a considerable psychosocial risk for workers, and certainly something that needs to be well managed. And there are, of course, ways to do that, and we'll mention those, but probably the most important is to ensure that organisations have a hybrid flexible working policy, so people do have some face-to-face contact with their co-workers and manager, but also to make sure managers keep good regular check-in and contact with their workers. A few others I'll mention: the workload. People save time in commutes, particularly in some of the cities where we research where commuting is a big issue, more so than here in Perth. That additional commute time was turned around into productive hours in many cases, which created longer work days. There was also more work intensity and more people working early in the morning and late into the evening. And that was a significant demand on workers that perhaps has not been considered well enough in terms of, are people getting enough balance of a rest time with their productive work. Work-family conflict we know all about, but that was obviously really hyped up when kids were at home as well from school, and both partners working at home. Nevertheless, to some extent, those things continue where people don't have a good balance between work and family life and don't manage that boundary well. Vulnerability was a really important thing in our studies. We found certain people had greater vulnerabilities to wellbeing concerns and were more affected by flexible working: those that lived alone, those with disabilities, those with care responsibilities. And one other thing that we found was perhaps a bit surprising, that people work flexibly had higher levels of ill treatment, either from managers or from co-workers, including workplace bullying, which we know has dreadful impacts on people's wellbeing and performance. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we talked about the demands briefly, and now I just want to talk about the role of the leader in supporting positive wellbeing, because as we know, the more demands people face, the more resources they need and support in order to balance those out and create wellbeing and stop people having negative mental health experiences. The literature talks about these in 4 particular areas, or we've organised them into 4 areas: leadership communication, leadership style, leadership and resource provision, and leadership commitment to employee wellbeing. Just to give you a couple of quick examples from each, and these are detailed in the FACTBase report. Leadership communication should be timely, transparent, regular, informative, honest, share what is known and what is still uncertain, empathetic and compassionate. Without that, it creates uncertainty, it creates fear, it creates a lack of trust, and these are the last things we need in a crisis. So the best leaders will have great communication abilities. We had that here at ECU. We were very lucky. We had a vice chancellor and executive deans who led in a way that let us know what the university was doing, what was expected of us, and how we'd be supported. They also talked about what we didn't know, but when we would know, when we would find out more information. So all these things help stop the uncertainty that leads to anxiety. The opposite was true in many organisations where those things were not present. Leadership style and practices would include inclusive and integrative leadership. I'm going to talk a bit more about inclusive leadership in a moment, because we found this to be a really powerful style. Role modelling the desired behaviours, empowering and trusting and relationship building. Leadership resource provision is how resources are provided to flexible workers is really important right through the organisation. So consideration of physical and social emotional resources, providing resources to promote resilience and self-care, and ensuring employees have sufficient infrastructure, flexibility and support to do their job. So those resources flowing through the organisation to ensure that flexible workers can do their job well, that managers are well resourced and so on. And then last of all, leadership commitment to well-being. So understanding stress and psychological distress and reducing levels as much as possible, having a genuine concern for employee well-being and communicating that, checking in on employees regularly, and adopting an individualised approach to supporting employees, knowing who your employees are and making sure you know what their needs are. We can have the next slide, please. From this, we created a bit of a conceptual model based on a number of our studies with flexible workers, both during the pandemic, before and afterwards. The first component of that, and you'll see the model runs left to right, and the influence runs from top leadership through to the teams and individuals working flexibly to result in what we want, which is a high performance and positive well-being. So the first element of that is a positive psychosocial safety climate. That's making sure that top leadership are committed to psychological safety in the organisation and communicate that really well and prioritise that amongst other things. Inclusive leadership, that's where leaders demonstrate openness, availability and flexibility to help employees satisfy their need for belongingness and their uniqueness. Really important variable in many of our studies. Both psychosocial safety climate and inclusive leadership were significantly related to positive health and wellbeing outcomes. And then strong relationship-oriented leadership. As I said before, we know we need that balance of task and relationship-oriented leadership, but during this particular time, relationship-oriented leadership really came to the fore as a key skill that managers needed. The result is adaptive and resilient teams, and we found those teams that did best had those the antecedents of the positive psychosocial safety climate and positive leadership. Next slide, please. Just to say a little bit about psychosocial safety climate, we found it where there were high levels of that. People reported a more healthy work environment, fewer psychosocial hazards, and a good balance of demands and resources. They also had superior well-being, and there were lower levels of bullying and ill treatment. And as I mentioned, these things seem to have escalated a bit under the pandemic, probably as people are under more stress and pressure. Next slide, please. So that's the sort of evidence. What do we need to do to build PSC? Ensure the well-being of employees is the foremost priority. Demonstrate high commitment to psychosocial well-being of staff. If we don't do that, then those and other initiatives we put in place, those wellness type initiatives, the stress management we might apply, and those other things aren't really going to do any good if people do not sense that the organisation is committed to their well-being, and particularly senior management, and they don't communicate that well. So it really is the starting point to a psychologically safe organisation. And then involving all staff in psychological health and safety. This is a real challenge when they work remotely, but this is something that has to happen. They have to be able to identify and report psychological hazards, and then communicate this support for psychological safety. Next slide, please. Inclusive leadership, we found, again, a lot of evidence that supported the role of inclusive leadership in wellbeing outcomes. We found a one-size-fits-all approach to leadership and to flexible working does not work. People have different situations. As I said, some people had vulnerabilities, and you'll see on point 3, people with carer duties, younger employees, those with an ongoing disability and so on, reported high levels of exposure to psychosocial hazards, including ill treatment from managers and co-workers. They also receive less resources and support, and so they are primed for poor wellbeing outcomes. And managers really need to take this inclusive approach to understand the different needs and unique situation of their workers and who are vulnerable, and to check in with them regularly. Next slide, please. And so the role of inclusive leadership, or to enhance that and build an inclusive culture, we need to develop inclusive leaders and inclusive management competencies. We need to develop inclusive HR practices. And our research is increasingly pointing in this direction, because we feel that these are the areas organisations really do need support. Avoid a one-size-fits-all arrangement. Just remember that your team, your people all have different circumstances and different needs, and address flexible working as an enabler of minority and vulnerable workers. Next slide, please. Relation-oriented leadership, and this is the last area I want to talk about today. Managers of successful teams spend a lot of time maintaining connectivity and providing social support to their team, and of course they're bridging that gap of the physical, bridging the physical distance and the need for physical contact with co-workers and managers. So that checking in and connecting the team became a really important aspect. Success during restrictions was attributed to the application of a higher trust and relationship-focused approach. So where teams performed well, adapted well, and were resilient, this was impacted or influenced by the manager relation-oriented behaviour. And then prolonged work at home resulted in managers getting involved in aspects of an employee life they might not have been involved with normally. And we find that managers under normal circumstances are not necessarily well equipped, well developed to deal with many of these things, let alone during a crisis, let alone when they have a window into people's lives and are seeing all manner of things that they wouldn't normally be aware of, seeing and learning about and hearing. And these are things we feel managers need more development in. Next slide, please. And so relation-oriented leadership has the following implications. This is what we need to do to build that, or this is what managers need to do to exhibit that, rather. So they need to regularly check in on their workers. And I think we've all heard quite a lot in the media about the importance of doing this. And I believe organisations are telling their line managers the importance of doing this. But it really does involve them having to understand the unique needs of their team and who wants to be checked in on regularly and who will see it as micromanagement. So it's really about understanding your team. And that's where that inclusive aspect comes into play. Develop people skills for managers around team relationship building, support and trust. Develop a new skill set for dealing with emotive and personal aspects. I do not imagine that line managers currently necessarily have any development within organisations on this, and we certainly need to be applying this. Certainly in some sectors they would, for instance, in the emergency services and so on, they might well have this, but in a regular public sector office environment, for instance, probably not. And implement practices that enhance trust and inclusion in the context of flexible working. Next slide, please. And so our take-home considerations from all of that is new ways of working require new ways of leading. And so we do need to further develop our leaders, and our leaders need to develop these skills, and organisations need to develop a culture that supports a growing prevalence for flexible working in or outside of a pandemic, into the new normal. There's going to be much more of it. So we need to develop an outcomes-based and trust-based culture. Top leadership must lead a culture of psychological safety from the front and commit the organisation to flexible working. That is fundamental. That's the starting point. We need to adopt an inclusive approach. We need inclusive leadership and inclusive HR development. Line managers of remote teams need training and development to support superior relation-oriented leadership. And teams need training and tools to support wellbeing and performance. And we are developing some of those tools here within the Centre for Work and Wellbeing at this time.
Thank you for listening to FACTBase Talks. Our research is available on our website to download free of charge, and you will find this bulletin and other bulletins related to the future of work and all other areas that the Committee for Perth covers on Perth and its future available there.